Hello everyone. My name is Simon Fu. I'm in the Early Modern Studies program here at King's, and I'm very happy to be chairing the two post sessions, Oceans, the Circulation of Knowledge about regional or global spaces. And you can look at the program or very quickly read here the description of it. Since we have two papers per session, there's a bit of leeway of time, and the presenters will be maybe saying a couple of things about themselves also for the presentations. Let's begin then with Katharine from York University, will be speaking on defining the oceans, science, internationalism, and hydrography in the 1920s and 1930s.
Hello, everybody. My name is Katharine Anderson. I'm at York University in Toronto, and I'm a historian of environmental sciences. And I've been interested for a long time in how one studies big phenomena in weather, and in now particularly in the oceanic parts of the world. And I think that this concern relates really well to the exploration of scaling and narrative that we were talking about in earlier sessions today. So the oceans of the global subject is the idea that connects all four of these talks spread generously across two sessions. And in particular, I think that they provide this really rich oceans provide this really rich site in which to ask questions about scale and about what globalism means, but also about technologies and science, so relations between different definitions of what science is, and about interrelationships between phenomena and regions that are both practical and epistemological. So I wanted to start off my talk. I wanted to briefly remind you of the present day multiple definitions of ocean using this note. There are 5 main oceans, but through in this whole website, they refer, they keep a line in there about the global. The emphasis on the global ocean is very critical to my own talk in this session is about internationalism and hydrography in the 1920s and 1930s. And there's kind of two groups for this this talk for me. And one of them has to do really with contemporary environmental politics, as well as the historiographical concerns that we were discussing again in all of our sessions so far, I'm sure we'll continue to discuss. And that's the call that we have been hearing over the last decade or so about how to really unpack the different meanings of global, perhaps using the word planetary, to differentiate from global or globalism, to differentiate from global, where international comes in to the picture. So there's these multiple definitions of global and how they acquire their significance. But really, it's the reason why those matter that is also, I think, really pertinent right now, which is this call that Matthias Heyman has put very well, that we need an understanding of these kinds of definitions of global knowledge, one of the epistemological claims and styles of knowledge that are associated with them, which interests and forces shaped, justified, and promoted this, what Matthias Heyman calls knowledge from above, by which he means these big database forms of knowledge. So that's one group of the talk. And the second is my involvement with a kind of historiography that is both history of science, but more than history of science, that we call oceans history, which is really concerned with the relations of human and natural worlds. And I'm currently working on a project to do with what I call the modern ocean in the 1920 interwar period. But I've been involved for the last couple of years since it inaugurated in the auspicious month of March 2020 with the Oceans in Depth series at University of Chicago Press with my colleague Helen Rozwadowski. So we've been working a lot with people about how they define oceans history. And so that's the other route to this talk. Sorry, that's, yeah. And I wanted to just quickly fly by you some idea of the historiography that is important to these themes, particularly to do with the ocean atmospheric aspect of these themes. And anybody who wants to come back to those, I can come back to those later. But I feel like in some ways I'm just amplifying what these other talkers are saying. My own talk today is going to focus on as a case study on this particular institution, which I think illustrates nicely the complexities that face us when we talk about the construction of the category of global or globalism. It's very much the IH International Hydrographic Bureau, which is now the IHO, is very much concerned with these with this period in the 1920s as a deliberate kind of invention of that period and an entry into the discussions of what big scale international collaboration or scientific internationalism works, and also really concerned with how to deal with the scale of the natural world and how to define it. So these are the kinds of questions that I think come up very nicely within the work of the International Hydrographic Bureau in the 1920s and 30s, the how you define environments. And particularly in this period of the new tools for defining these fluid and deep and inaccessible environments, the technologies and the techniques that are beginning to show the shapes of water masses in oceans and the shapes of currents at different depths, and name bodies of oceanic phenomena in new ways, as well as, of course, the well-known development of the sounding techniques for making visible the appearance of the ocean floor. So that's centrally the work of the Hydrographic Bureau, is to try and in ways map the features of the ocean for both practical and administrative purposes. And they are very much the post-World War I movement for scientific internationalism, which many of you will know all about. And they're also very much filled with the geopolitical ambitions for marine futures. I would say that is also part of post-World War I. And it's really that this last question that I'm going to be talking about today. So The IHB, which is now called the IHO, the International Hydrography or Hydrographic Organization, was founded in 1921, and it grew from the immediate pre-World War I and post-World War I discussions about the need to standardize and systematize navigational information, but also to publicize and spread the new scientific knowledge of the sea. So it was both sort of technical mapping and standards bureau, but also saw itself as a kind of scientific public science dissemination. It was also initially very much a allied organization. So that's another familiar part of the scientific internationalism movement in the immediate wake of 1918. And it was dominated by the British, the French, and the American oceanographers, and remained dominated by them through the interwar years. Because of its role in publicizing the new science of the oceans, it's a participant in this complicated disciplinary identity, and I think disciplines are important to the narratives that we have about globalism and the ideas of scale and its construction. And I'll come back to that in a bit. But it's also what is really invisible, I find, in the history of the oceans in this period. It's a really striking reminder of the place in both the practical matters and political geopolitics, of course, but also the imagination of shipping and oceans in the immediate post-war period. Hence, if you were at the session last night, hence that board game that I was showing about cargo ships. But the IHO, just one thing that I certainly didn't know about them is that they're the very first international organization to become affiliated with the new League of Nations in 1921. And the very first international gathering of the League in general has to do with the work of the IHB, with the Barcelona meeting on transit and communication in April 1921. And then the first treaty of the League of Nations is the October 1921 Treaty on Transit and Communications. So it's really central to that idea of the new era that dawns after 1918, and in the minds of the League of Nations mandarins. It's the experience of the collaborative or cooperative movement to control shipping in the last 2 years of the war, in 1917 and 1918, that is so important to this idea of what's the future of the maritime shipping and the future of the modern economy. So the idea that they were able to cooperate, the Allies were able to cooperate and distribute all the needs of the Allied countries collaboratively while maintaining national decision bodies as well, was this seemed to people in the early 1920s as this remarkable example of how the future of world cooperation could unfold. And it was based on the kind of the massive shipbuilding that the United States put on in 1918 and 19 that really ended the war. I mean, it's very clear that is that program is what makes it possible to get the troops, the American troops, over to Europe and end the war. So there's this history of shipping that's behind and the sort of an ideological aspect of the history of shipping that's behind the IHB. So, but one of the main tasks of the IHB is to as you can imagine, is to sort of set up administrative structures to define who, what publications parts of the oceans should appear in, in the pilot guides or the charts, which bodies of water should appear in which books. This is not a question that would arise now in the digital age, but in the print age, which actual book collection you needed to have out on your navigational table would be important, and also whose national responsibility it was to collect and recollect, redo any necessary surveying and for these things, is the sort of administrative job that the IHB was set up to carry out. But it quickly gets mixed up with scientific questions. And I put this one in for Sam and Daniella, who are next and going to talk about the polar regions. It's one of the key cases of the debates about this has to do with whether or not to have a body of water called the Southern Ocean, and what the politics and the natural basis, the political and the natural basis for that decision would be. So that's one example. The Southern Ocean question is one example of this, but the debate continues on from the moment of the foundation of the IHB through the rest of the interwar period. And indeed, these kinds of debates, as you saw from the NOAA website with 4, 5, or 1 ocean, in a way still continue. But what happens in this particular version of the story that I'm telling now is that in a few years after the gathering of information about the Southern Ocean, Germany's great oceanographer, leading oceanographer, Georg Buss, enters the discussion in a really aggressive way in the pages of the journal, the Scientific Public Science Dissemination Journal Initiative of the IHB, and says that that we have to define the oceans on a natural basis, and insists on the primacy of a natural explanation for the oceans and its divisions. And in very Germanic fashion, he lays out in this long article in the International Hydrographic Review what he thinks should be. And he points to the problems that face us when we try to make these divisions if we consider the depths of the ocean. If we take a kind of vertical stance and try to make a slice all the way through, we won't find that the phenomenon overlap enough to call something a natural region. And so our only recourse, Buss says, is to start from the bottom up. We have to start from the floor, and therefore its influences on currents and the shapes of water masses. And so we have to define everything by basically acoustic soundings and the information that we have about the ocean floor topography. Okay, and he weighs in on the little vexed question of the Southern Ocean as well. So this 1936 intervention is actually, I think, I've sort of gradually been realizing more and more how aggressive it is. And you have to remember what is happening in 1936 to really understand it. So 1936 is when Germany remilitarizes the Rhine, and when Italy goes into Ethiopia. Germany has become a member of the IHB only in 1929. So after that first official document setting out the limit of entry. And yet Germany has arguably one of the most prestigious institutes of oceanography in the world, and is known for its new techniques of oceanography. So Buss is going in and making his case for ocean basins and their shapes coming from the bottom up, using the big data kind of techniques, the indirect measurements, assessments, and making sort of more unusual arguments about how seas should fit somehow within the ocean basins. And so the response from the IHB is really very, Vance is de Blavois is the director at this point, and his response is essentially to pivot away from, not entirely away from the science, but to insist that there has to be a balance of perspectives on how the oceans are divided, and we can't simply adopt what he called the special character and complicated ideas of modern oceanography to define our regions. And he said, for the navigator, the consideration of the surface phenomena obviously are more striking and hold more interest for him than the forms of the bottom. He's really explicit then that we can't leave out, we can't adopt a picture of the oceans using the categories and language of oceanographers and leaving out of consideration all the acquired habits which are of primary importance to their users. So we're then talking about whose ocean it is really in this debate. So just quickly interpreting this debate, you could read this simply as a legacy of the kind of national imperial rivalries that have been going on, especially between Great Britain and Germany since the end of the 19th century, and complicated further by all the international organizations set up in the last 20, 30 years to study the oceans and the rivalries between them, which are really strong. But I think there's something much more important going on here, that there's an epistemological story behind all these nomenclature or disputes or the national tensions between bodies about what a natural region is. And the very opening of Wuest's 1936 paper asked this question explicitly: are there any natural regions in the open seas of the world which we can recognize by the eye and can be considered as, quote, landscapes of the ocean? So time won't permit me to go into the sort of larger debate about natural regions here, but I want to just point out that this is what underlies these debates about limits. Is the question of the relationships that there should be between a natural region and a human region, and that those are classic questions of natural determinism as well, entangled within those, and what kinds of measurements and knowledge should be the basis for how we understand and divide up and categorize the world, and insist on standardizing it across the whole globe. And Wuest's answer to that question that he asked is really both yes and no. No, you can't define a maritime region because so much of them is hidden. And you can't use surface phenomena literally to define such regions. This is phenomena that are in fact too superficial. And he says, in terms of the yes, he answers that you must define these regions by using the forcing agency, by understanding the forcing agency that comes from understanding the ocean floor, the topography, and the kinds of information that means is the indirect measurements of salinity and temperature and pressure, the modern physical dynamics of fluids that is developed in both the atmosphere and in oceanography. But that's a very specialized and kind of deliberately indirect and deliberately quantitative approach to understanding the oceans as a space. And Bush comes out very strongly and says that in fact, these landscapes disclose themselves by these techniques of indirect measurement. So his intervention in 1936 is very much trying to take a stand and, force a position on the primacy of big data, the kinds of measurement that are related to these new techniques of physical dynamics, and decenter the traditions of not just hydrographic and navigators' knowledge, which is one, but also older traditions of holistic knowledge that have to do with geography, the discipline of geography. So in my remaining 2 minutes or so, I just want to point out the sort of genealogy of this intervention in hydrographic and oceanographic science has this place in these debates about what is a natural region and how do we define units of what are the higher units of analysis as a well-known English geographer suggested. And one of his opponents is actually another German, but a German from an earlier generation who was trained in physical geography, but a different tradition of physical geography than the new physical dynamics tradition of Buss and his Berlin Institute. Okay, and Schott's kind of approach is to say that we have to have this comprehensive whole, but he agrees that this is essentially fiction at the same time. So he makes it, he divides the world up. Again, by a second work that he publishes in 1912 on the Atlantic Ocean, and then extends it to the Pacific and the Indian Ocean in 1936, and divides up the world this way. So he's establishing divisions in the ocean, but also admitting that these are essentially fictions. They can only be constructions. So I don't have for space, I just will very quickly mention a couple of other people doing the same kind of work in the 1920s and 1930s. An American geographer, Preston James, tries to apply Köppen's techniques to Schmidt's categories of the ocean and insist on a better characterization. And then there's similarly a French geographer wants to insist on a different version of holism. So these debates that are emerging in the pages of the IHR, the scientific dissemination journal of the International Hydrographic Bureau, are trying to are coming out of these larger debates about how to build up holistic or unified pictures of phenomena and environments across very difficult to define areas. So these are, and I want to insist that these are clearly both political and epistemological concerns, especially in this setting of the immediate post-war scientific nationalism. Natural region, it becomes a category closely linked to lots of other concerns. What kind of data matters? Can we combine or correlate well human and natural scales, human and natural environments? And in which direction do lines of determine, if there are causal relationships, which direction do they run into? And these are really acute questions for the first half of the the 20th century, and I think are re-emerging as acute in our own day as well. And so I will stop there.
Okay, so we have some a bit of time for questions.
So I have two quite different questions. The first is, I'm interested that although biology gets named as a word, there's no discussion about, there's no discussion about who's in the water and what does that matter, and wondered whether.
Who or what?
What? That's, I'll send you your rails.
Yeah.
So is that a piece of determining anything about that kind of?
It is. Not for Wust, because he's insisting that biological phenomena are red herrings, as it were. But for the older geographer Schatz, yes, you have to find a way of including biological phenomena as well. Where I think Wust doesn't push living things aside in a way, and Vallot, the French geographer, also is that implicitly they are acknowledging the human ocean in what they do, right? So they might be disregarding the movement of fish because that's a whole nother world of complication, and there are other international bodies that are going to take that up. But anyway, physical geography, the new physical dynamics, that's more important. That's the bottom up, which is really a top down argument about data and physical measurement.
And the
or
second
primacy.
question is, why does it matter how many oceans there are?
Okay, so well, the short it matters administratively and it matters politically. So and it still does. So one of the things that I flipped by really quickly in terms of the works that have inspired me is work coming from anthropologists and political scientists about ocean regions that help us insist that if we understand the ocean more as regions, we're able to decenter the dominant attitudes. We're able to counteract the apartheid of climate change, for instance.
Oh, okay.
Right? So regionalizing the world is one in contemporary stuff is one way of insisting that other perspectives on these problems matter. Other kinds of knowledge need to be brought into the picture as opposed to the techniques and styles of knowledge that have become the gold standard. So that's why regions continue to matter, and I think mattered then for those similar kinds of regions.
What questions?
Thank you so much. I'm going to have a question about animals and migrations and birds and so on too, so that I think already clearing that one. But just to expand on the second question, and looking at the German perspective of 1936, do you think that in terms of trying to redefine them as natural areas that don't have a political connection, the loss of colonies and the fact that they don't have much of an outlet to an ocean or any, do you think that is right?
It's hard to believe that anything Bush says about the primacy of natural definitions is not connected to Nazi era arguments about human and human geography, right? So the thing I would like to know, and I haven't been able to go to the archives, I would like to know sort of what's behind Wust's intervention at that moment, because this is an article he had published in a German journal earlier and then republished in this one. But why then? Because he'd been saying these kinds of things since he came back from the South Atlantic meteor expedition in you know the late 1920s. He'd been saying these kinds of things about the importance of physical definitions of bodies of water. But why in 36 does he insist on stirring the pot, as it were, again? And I don't have the sources to answer that, but my gut tells me there has to be a connection.
Maybe time for a quick question.
Oh, maybe I'll just have to.
Okay, that's okay, thank you, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, let's turn to our next two speakers. Daniella McCahey from Texas Tech University and Sam Robinson, University of York, will be speaking on geopolitical circulation of knowledge, whales, the Southern Ocean, and the discovery investigations.
Has that worked?
Yeah, it looks good from here.
Give him a second in the room.
Okay, we are seeing you, we're seeing your slide.
Great.
Welcome to Halifax.
Thanks. I've got my the world needs more Canada mug with me today, just for this. Right, we'll crack on. So my name is Sam Robinson. As just been introduced, I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of York, and I'm working on a book project with my colleague Daniella McCahey. He's also here, who will speak in a moment, who's an assistant professor at Texas Tech University. And Daniella's research is about science and exploration in Antarctica, and my research is more to do with the history of oceanography. And what we are trying to do together is write the first history of the discovery investigations, which is probably the largest big science project before the Manhattan Project that you have never heard of. But is, as you'll see in this talk, really important still today to our understanding and knowledge of things such as whales, which are no longer really allowed to kill for science, or the Southern Ocean. So I will just crack on. If I can get my slides to advance, there we go. So our story, which is richly illustrated, I see Jim's in the audience, so this book's going to be expensive when it comes out, concerns a commercial practice that Europeans have been undertaking for about 1200 years at the turn of the 20th century, which is commercial whaling. Largely that had been overfished to death in the northern waters, particularly around the Arctic. And so with a new invention of the steam whale catcher, but also the explosive harpoon, whalers started to turn towards the Southern Atlantic, where bigger whales could be found, which had hitherto not been fished. And so whaling began in South Georgia, which is a place in subantarctic waters that was claimed by the British in 1904. And sealing had taken place earlier. The Americans had come in 1818 to 1820 and taken literally hundreds of thousands of fur seals, and they'd sporadically come down to take seals for oil. And the main station in South Georgia is called Grytviken, which is in Norwegian means big pot. And that was because the Norwegians found a massive cast iron pot that the Americans had used to boil down seals. So the industry is largely a Norwegian, British, and Argentinian endeavor. And whales, we don't think of whales as particularly being an important commodity, but at the turn of the 20th century, as they had been for hundreds of years, but for different and differing and changing purposes, whales are really important in the global economy. So they're used to produce margarine, which becomes an important foodstuff in the First World War. They're used to produce soap. Queen Victoria washed herself in whale-derived soap. And they're used as a lubricant in all sorts of different products. But the main purpose that makes them really relevant in the context of the early 20th century is that whale oil becomes a key ingredient in the production of glycerine, which is, of course, goes on to make nitroglycerine, which is the high explosive predominantly used in World War One. And this is a poster with a seal on it from a German fisheries Navy board asking fishermen to bring back to harbour seals and dolphins that they would have been bycatch before the war, so that they could be boiled down to provide oil that could be used to produce German glycerine. So whales are an important commodity of the early 20th century. Daniella.
So within 4 years of the beginning of this industrial whaling program in 1908, Great Britain made a formal claim to an enormous swath of the Southern Ocean, which were the waters surrounding the territory that they dubbed the Falkland Islands dependencies. And you can see a picture of that there. The very same day that Great Britain laid claim to the Falkland Islands dependency, the governor of the Falkland Islands issued a new ordinance to regulate the colony's whale fishery. From now, quote, "It shall not be lawful for any person to kill, take, hunt, or attempt to kill or take any whale in colonial waters unless he shall have first been duly licensed." And from this point forward, that officially includes the use of, quote, "the harbors of any or all of the dependencies of the Falkland Islands." Now, within a decade of this, more whales were being taken from the Southern Ocean than the rest of the world combined. And the Southern Ocean kind of transformed into being this frontier to Antarctica, or this frontier to a land of exploration or heroism, to a colonial space that needed management, a space, in the words of Peter Roberts, where whales were not only the most valuable economic resource, the most valuable commodity, but actually British imperial subjects, so subject to the rule and orders of the colonial office. And you can see this kind of thing noted at the time. The Antarctic explorer Thomas Griffith Taylor asserted in 1930 that, quote, "In Antarctica, it would appear that the flag follows the trade. No nation made any definite claim to Antarctica until the development of whaling in southern waters showed that, however poor the land might be, here was very valuable territory." Sam.
So I just wanted to show you some of the images to show how quickly this whaling becomes industrialized. So we can see here, this is a picture from 1915. The Norwegians bring the ultimate tool of empire, according to Hedrick, the steam engine to move bits of the whale oil around the plantations. They use the only bit of flat land to create a soccer field so that they can have inter-whale station competitions. They create clubhouses for the whalers because they have to be sophisticated people, even if they're not doing sophisticated work. And they even had a brass band, and this is probably the most southerly brass band ever created on Earth. And going off Katie's argument about modernity in the oceans, modernity comes to South Georgia through this industry. In the early period after the First World War, they create the Grytviken Kino, a cinema, which, you know, this is a big investment of time and money. And I was going to show you a load of coffins, because obviously if something goes wrong in the Southern Ocean, you die, to be clear. But I thought I'd show you this letter because I think it's funnier. And this is a letter from the Salveston Company to a merchant in Glasgow, saying, where basically they'd sent insufficient quality of pea to make pea soup. And the letter says, "To send provisions so far away is a very serious matter, sending out inferior goods. As such goods can only be supplied from home." So this becomes a frontier for industry right at the end of empire, but it's also quite a modern space, quite an industrial space. And why does that matter? And why did the British were so careful to legislate it? Well, it's about, in the British mindset of the colonial office in the 1910s, about creating both a sustainable industry and a viable colony. Now, if you think that sustainability in the oceans only appears with the maximum sustainable yield debates of the 1950s, you are wrong. Questions around whether there could be sustainable levels for fisheries go back to the 1870s, if not earlier. And in this case, it's actually a Norwegian whaling engineer who had a whole career in the Arctic, which had evaporated when the whales were no longer to be found and had to move south, who wrote to Sidney Harmer, the scientist who was the keeper of zoology at the British Museum, arguing that, quote, a certain proportion of the whaling dues, that's the tax, should be set aside for scientific research. This leads quite quickly to the Colonial Office installing a committee that is formed of the Colonial Office, the Foreign Office, the Cabinet Office, Department of Industry, representatives from the Australian Embassy, representatives from the South African Embassy in London, and scientists like Harmer to discuss a key question, which is whether whales needed protection of the British government owing to the present rate of fisheries. Because if you could create a southern colony of in what was a space of about 2 million square kilometers of ocean, you would have a huge amount of power to then go on to get onto Antarctica. Now, this first committee falls apart during the start of the First World War because there are other things on people's mind, but also because instantly the Royal Navy and the Ministry of Munitions argue that the quota on whales should be removed because we need as much glycerine as possible to blow as many things up as humanly possible in Flanders. And the whaling industry goes into overdrive, and the number of whales killed in the first few years of the war is of an unprecedentedly large scale. This concerns both officials in the Colonial Office and scientists. And so before the war had ended in early 1918, a second committee is formed on a much more established basis. They move much quicker because they realized that the slow committee first time round had failed. And they report in 1919. The report itself is 30 pages long. The evidence supplied with the report, the scientific evidence, is 130 pages beyond that, draws on scientists from Norway, from Sweden, from the UK. And they suggest that the tax should be tripled and that they should employ research vessels. And then there's a third committee, which is largely relevant to this paper, but basically I wanted to point it out because it's called for by Winston Churchill. So this is the very elite of the British society at the time. And they set out a scientific program. So it's a political, governmental, governance, scientific program. Now, what that causes to come into effect is this is a mouthful, the Whale Research Executive Committee, which is later changed to the Discovery Investigations Committee, because they buy the Discovery, which is Scott's vessel from the age of exploration. And they send the Discovery to the Southern Ocean, which is a big tall ship with sails. It's not very modern. It's not really very suitable, but it's what they have. And they also send scientists literally down to South Georgia to work on the cleansing platforms, which you can see in the photograph, and take samples straight off the whales before they're boiled down. And over time, the Discovery Investigations, which has no permanent base in the UK except a room in the Colonial Office, all of its infrastructure is in the Southern Ocean, expands to more modern ship, the William Scoresby, and then a custom-built ship to replace Discovery called the Discovery 2, which enables them to go beyond the waters of South Georgia and start to look at the entirety of the Southern Ocean. They return a huge number of specimens, but the purpose of this, the industry by committee element in the title here, is never really fully dealt with. There's always a tension between the questionable economic benefit of the research they're doing and also the scientific discovery element of the research that they're doing. And the expeditions were always about more than just science, economics, or imperialism. Daniella.
So the men associated with the Discovery investigation, who, while they were in the territorial waters of the Falkland Islands dependencies, were subject to the orders of the governor. So like this is really portrayed, these waters are portrayed as like an extension of the rule of the governor. They were keenly aware of the economic motivations for their program's existence, and that they existed to support, on one hand, the killing of the whales and the tax revenue and everything that engendered, but also simultaneously gathering information to prevent the collapse of the industry. In 1930, you see Colonial Office civil servant Roland Darney, who was then the chairman of the Discovery investigation. He wrote that investigations into the anatomy, migration, diet, and behavior of Southern Ocean whales will undoubtedly have much importance into inquiries into Southern whaling. They all converge upon the central problem of estimating the number of whales of each species, which may be taken annually without depleting the stock. Of course, Darnley added that the Discovery investigations are not only concerned with whaling. but so far as the resources permit, with all economic questions arising in the dependencies. So this was not just about whaling, it was about creating an economically viable colony. Slide. Similarly, Stanley Kemp, who was the first head scientist of the program, he wrote in 1929 that the origins of the discovery investigations had, quote, in view the systematic exploration of all the economic resources of the dependencies of the Falkland Islands, but the main reasons for it are to be traced to the very rapid development of the whaling industry in those dependencies. When concrete plans for research were being undertaken, preference was given to investigations holding the most early promise of economic results. Yet he continued, since the primary aim of the investigations was an economic one, priority of place had evidently to be given to inquiries which might lead to immediately useful results. That's not to say that they didn't conduct other research, but the priority was definitely for things that could have an economic application. Slide. One of the key features of the discovery investigations, of course, is the immense dependence on support from the whaling stations and the whaling ships as well. On South Georgia, as well as on Deception Island initially in the South Shetlands, the biologists had access to whale anatomy, performing some of the first major studies into, for instance, the diet and reproduction of blue and fin whales. Aboard their various ships, the men also engaged in a whale marking program, firing darts at whales as they swam. And then they established a bounty for these darts, reimbursing the whales who submitted them. So you can see here on the left-hand side, the original darts that they used, and then with instructions on how to return to the Colonial Office for a for money. And on the other side, on the right-hand side, you can see the ones that replaced in, I think, 1934, which were allegedly of better quality. Slide. So this system of whale marking even further reified the whales as kind of British subjects. I saw somebody in the comments mentioning something about whales being royal fish, like legally in the English history. And yeah, I mean, that's part of our argument is that this is a continuation of that. These whales were circulating in and out of British waters, and they were carrying these tags, passports, if you will, demonstrating that they had once swum in British territory. Slide. And in order to claim these rewards, the whalers, who were largely Norwegian, they needed to file paperwork with the Colonial Office. Now, most of these whale tags were collected from ocean space already claimed by the British, but by filling out these forms and submitting them, this is part of, the Norwegians, at least, acceptance of British sovereign control. This is part of an infrastructure. So the DI generally leads to this infrastructure and colonial system moving the boundaries of civilization further south into this terraqueous territory. Sam.
So that's one example of the geopolitical construction of the science and how it's circulating knowledge. A second way that we wanted to talk about is the reports themselves. So the science itself takes place over about a 20-year period. In fact, it's really 15 years. It takes another 40 years beyond the end of those initial 15 years to write up all the reports. So they produced 38 volumes of reports. The final one is released in 1980. They're written by scientists who go on the expeditions, who at the time in which they write are quite junior. Most of them don't have PhDs, but will later go on to be very senior British scientists within the field of biology or within oceanography. I wanted to point out, because this is often lost in the history of oceanography, that at least four, but I think more like 10 to 12 of the reports were authored by women who were banned from going on the ships. So you have people who, I mean, all four of the women I've put on this slide deserve to have entire PhD theses written about them. But we've got people like Anne Massey, who was an Irish self-taught marine biologist, Grace Pickford, who was English-born, did natural sciences at Cambridge, was refused permission to do graduate work, so went to Yale, got a PhD, and worked at Yale for the rest of her career. Isabella Gordon, a Scottish marine biologist who works at the Natural History Museum, who was assistant keeper of zoology under Harmer, and Helen Rowett, who was a lecturer in zoology at Plymouth, who was the daughter of John Rowett, who had funded all of Shackleton's expeditions. So there's a link between the age of exploration and the age of science. These reports, as you can see there, are issued by the Discovery Committee of the Colonial Office in London on behalf of the government and dependencies of the Falkland Islands. They were published by Cambridge University Press, giving them scientific legitimacy rather than Her Majesty's Stationery Office. And they are funded to a great amount of loss by the Colonial Office. They're lavishly illustrated. They're beautiful, like absolutely beautiful volumes. And from the outset, in a very thick file that me and Daniella have looked at in Southampton, the Colonial Office decided that it would be prudent to send copies of the reports outside of the British Empire, free of charge, not to all of the universities within the British Empire, showing that you would be sharing knowledge, but note, copies to countries outside the British Empire, to their national libraries. And so they send them to Austria, Belgium, Brazil, Denmark, France, Germany, Holland, Italy, Japan, Monaco, Norway, Portugal, Spain, Sweden, US, and the USSR. Any country that could have mounted oceanographic research to challenge the British leadership in the Southern Ocean. Now, over time, this list is expanded by the Foreign Office, but I wanted to give you an example of how this kind of thing worked. So this is turning the science, the knowledge, into a diplomatic object to be shared, to be placed very deliberately. And so here is a letter in that big fat file we've looked at from the Library of Congress. And you might read this innocently as exactly what it says on the tin. I beg to acknowledge with cordial appreciation the receipt of the gift mentioned below, which is the Discovery reports. But if we look a bit further back into these reports, we can see that the reason that anything ends up in the Library of Congress is thanks to the UK Foreign Office, who write to the Colonial Office and instruct them that they suggest for the consideration of the Discovery Committee that the gift of a volume is given to the Library of Congress, and it's made conditional upon the supply in an exchange basis of an equivalent value in American documents of interest to the committee itself or to the Colonial Office more generally. So there's two things going on here. On the one hand, there is a circulation of knowledge about sharing and exchange, what many historians of science have written about over many years. I give you my science, you give me yours. It's all open source intelligence. We all know what we're all doing. The other much more geopolitically strategic thing that's going on here, we argue, is that the example of British technological, scientific, and technocratic power in the Southern Ocean is being deliberately placed in multiple national libraries around the world, so that if the British ever needed to lean on that for political reasons, it would be very difficult to deny the power of that science because it was sitting in Washington, DC, in Vienna, in Berlin. So I'll hand you over to Daniella to
and I mean, something that we find particularly interesting is the fact that this, we actually found evidence in the archives that this is part of a deliberate strategy where they, British argued that if they just made like a singular claim to all of the Southern Ocean, it would be generally rejected. But by this kind of process of gradually forcing people to recognize it, it would be more likely that it would be recognized. Now, this kind of shifts in the 1940s. World War II essentially kills the discovery investigations, which were absorbed into the National Institute of Oceanography in 1949. In the early 1940s, Argentina and Chile both laid claim to much of the British Antarctic territory, the Falkland Islands dependency, marking the beginning for the British and those two countries as well of a new and somewhat cheaper strategy for geopolitics in the region, which was the permanent settlement of the land. The British whaling industry, or the whaling industry at South Georgia, lasted until the early 1960s, but by the late 1930s, before the war, the discovery investigations were already struggling to remain funded, and they were also facing a reality that whaling could not likely be both simultaneously profitable and sustainable. Furthermore, the new technology of pelagic ships reduced the tax and even licensing revenue for the Colonial Office. Nevertheless, the United Kingdom continued to draw on the legacy of the discovery investigations in this new ongoing sovereignty dispute with Argentina and Chile. In 1955, the United Kingdom filed a complaint with the International Court of Justice, claiming that Argentina and Chile were refusing to accept British primacy. And this application argued that due to the sharp increase of extractive activities at the start of the 20th century, these sort of new intensive whaling activities called for, quote, a corresponding exercise of state authority in the Antarctic. It was through the work of the discovery investigations that, quote, Great Britain alone undertook the responsibilities of sovereignty and performed the functions of a state. Because the Colonial Office had established a program to manage the Southern Ocean, its claims to the region were more legitimate. Now, the DI wasn't the only thing it argued fulfilled the functions of a state, but the proceedings for the case specifically references the importance of the discovery reports, submitting that, quote, a large and important body of scientific material has been published by the committee in the 27 volumes of discovery reports, and its research on the natural history of whales is admitted by expert opinion to have made a vital contribution towards the effective solving of the international problem of the conservation of whale fisheries. Now, Chile and Argentina never formally responded to this ICJ complaint, and the 1959 Antarctic Treaty largely made a lot of the issues of or dispute moot, even as the three countries still continue to kind of passive-aggressively maintain their claims. For example, in South Georgia, which is not covered by the Antarctic Treaty, it was a site that saw action during the Falklands conflict, and today on their government website, it talks about how the government goes beyond the standards imposed by the International Convention, meaning that it operates some of the best managed fisheries in the world. So again, using its kind of control and management of the marine resources as a way to justify its or bolster its control of the region. Slide. Some of the work set up during the DI continues. So Alistair Hardy, who is also a talented artist, and his work primarily with the DI primarily drew upon his invention, the continuous plankton recorder, which collects plankton samples and stores them on a moving band of silk and preserves them in formalin. He left the DI after only a couple of years to focus entirely on this work. And slide. His plankton study is actually still ongoing. As you can see from the screenshot I took from their website the other day, it is one of the world's longest running and most geographically extensive marine ecological surveys. Slide. But there are other ways that even the long concluded parts of the DI continue to matter for research. So like today, scientists who collaborate with whalers tend to be pretty reviled. A key critique of Japan's JARPA program was their dependence on lethal take, something that it was, argued in their own ICJ case that legitimate whale scientists would not depend on. In fact, it was suggested that JARPA only existed to justify and support Japan's whale eating culture. But because of the widespread condemnation of whale killing in Western culture, the studies of anatomy, diet, and reproduction are really only being repeated by Icelandic, Norwegian, and Japanese scientists, and at a far, far lower scale than the DI had. According to the Smithsonian paleontologist Nick Payenson, the Discovery Investigations collaborators with whalers has given us a lot of basic biology about whales that we would not know otherwise. He wondered whether or not the scientists involved who collected these data recognized that the chance to do so would never happen again. The DI measurements still provide baseline information for him and other whale scientists for anatomy, ranging from jaw length, mouth width, body length, and more. So even today, we see whale scientists poring over the raw measurements available in the discovery reports. He, in fact, specifically references the reports sent to the United States in the 1930s. So slide. In conclusion, you can see that even today, much of the knowledge we have about the Southern Ocean still comes from this work that was undertaken to establish international recognition of British sovereignty over its mass ocean empire through the circulation of oceanographic knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have time for questions for Daniella and Sam.
So, I wanted to know, how much the sort of contested history of the Southern Ocean is a part of modern understandings of Antarctica and whaling and so on. That you've described this history beautifully in your packed talk, but do people working there in the 50s or 60s or 70s, do they have a sense of the historical legacies that they are working within?
I'm not sure. Do you mean like, are they aware of the fact that they're dealing like in the 50s and 60s? Are they aware of the geopolitics that they're working in or whatever?
Geopolitics, but do they have a sense of history themselves, apart from sort of looking back to Shackleton and the complications of the previous 50 years or 60 years?
I mean, I can try and answer that. There's a direct connection through. So all Antarctic science for the British in the interwar period is the DI. And then at the end of the Second World War, it splits, and a very active DI scientist, James Marr, who actually, funnily enough, went on Shackleton's last expedition, but not as a scientist, as a Boy Scout. That's a different story. He leads the first overwinter on Antarctic Peninsula expedition that becomes FIDS. That's called Operation Tarbarin. And then that's a split. And in a book that I wrote a while ago, I talk about the split. Oceanography and the British Antarctic Survey, what will become split at the end of the Second World War. But there's always cross between them. And I think it's important that the DI reports are still coming out in the period of the 50s and 60s. And they are important for the waters, but and the reason the book isn't a 20th century history of Britain and the Antarctic is the technologies change. In the interwar period, going onto the ice is very dangerous. We have a bit in the book where we argue actually that the permanence of whaling and the DI means that no one dies doing expeditions in Antarctica and interwar, which is true. But British science is mostly concerned with water. After the war, it moves to being more concerned with the ice. And South Georgia is currently administrated as part of British Antarctic Territory under the British Antarctic Survey in Cambridge. And you can't go there, although cruise ships go quite regularly, but you can't just go there as a civilian.
Well, and I mean, following up on that, the linkage between British polar and marine science is very much there, but there actually have been very deliberate decisions since the split to kind of keep them separate, because of the geopolitical role that the British Antarctic Survey plays over the claim to the Falkland Islands dependencies, and South Georgia included, which is not covered by the treaty. And in 2012, the National Natural Resource Council, Research Council,
Natural Environment Research Council,
Research Council, sorry. They proposed absorbing the British Antarctic Survey into the National Institute of Oceanography, and the head of NERC was actually called before Parliament and like made to answer questions from the Prime Ministers, Cameron at the time, and others, by basically being like, you clearly don't understand the geopolitical role that the British Antarctic Survey plays, which is why we need to keep it as its own thing, not even though it performs a lot of the same type of work. So it seemed like sort of a sensible decision to like combine them. But there have been the strategy of like, let's occupy the peninsula and focus on an Antarctic governmental bureaucracy or whatever has kind of stuck because of this kind of territorial dispute.
Other questions?
Yes, I was interested in the language of colonization and these attempts to, in a way, cater for permanent human occupation. And I wonder whether you could say a little bit more about that. I just happen to know about the fate of the reindeer that the
Yep.
that the Norwegians brought. So there were apparently successful attempts to make it habitable in a way, and it's not. If I'm not completely wrong, it's not totally inconceivable that humans could live on South Georgia Island. So I wonder whether that really was a serious project to make it habitable, or whether it always was just thought of in terms of stations where people come for shorter periods of time.
It was a serious project to make the entire Falkland Islands and Falkland Island dependencies pay their own way. This is, and this is for all the colonies, not just for this particular colony. The British government in the early 20th century moves towards suggesting that the colonies should be financially self-sufficient. And Falkland isn't. It's difficult to be a self-sufficient colony when what you have done as your industry is sheep, and what is dying is your traditional role. So Port Stanley on the Falklands role had been as a port when your ship is battered by going around Cape Horn, where you get repairs. But as ship technology shifts from sailing ship to steamship, they tend to not have problems, and they sail on past, and so that part of the Falkland Island economy is gone. So this is an opportunity through resource extraction to create a colony that can pay its own way, is also more sustainable and rather than expensive. And you're right, the example that's in the book but not in our talk is the Norwegians bring reindeer, but they can only manage to keep enough reindeer so that they can occasionally have a break from their diet of salted pork, beef, and fresh whale and mutton from Falkland with a bit of reindeer at Christmas. It's never able to create the amount of flocks of reindeer that you would be able to support the amount of whalers that are there. The thing that we have not yet found in the documents, because finding the Colonial Office documents about FIDs that are not just to do with tax is quite hard, is what they thought was a sustainable population on South Georgia, which I think is the question you're really asking, Stefan. Is what's the viable number of people that you could be self-sufficient colony? And we haven't found any discussion of that. It's always supposed that stuff will come in. Hardy writes in the 1920s about how much money must have been being made when he discovers that there's a huge abandoned whaling station around the corner from Grytviken, with locomotives and all of the things that I showed, and it was abandoned. And he also talks about the loss. There's another whaling station that in 1913 is destroyed by an avalanche. So it's very expensive, very precarious. But the route here is, for the British government at least, is about creating a viable, sustainable colony. They're also concerned actually about the lack of British whalers. Most of the people working down here are Norwegians or Argentinians. There's a few Shetlanders from the UK, but that's it. And there's even Russians there who stage a mutiny in 1919 when they discover the Russian revolutions happened. Unfortunately, it's put down when a day later a British Royal Navy ship turns up that they weren't expecting and arrests the whole lot of them. So it's a hilarious story in many respects about this place at the end of the earth, but there's some serious science and serious politics behind it all.
Yeah, so I've actually before Sam suggested we do this project together. I've been planning on writing a whole history of the British Empire through South Georgia, because South Georgia is in some ways like this very fascinating encapsulation of a lot of things going on in the British Empire more broadly. And there were, before the introduction of the reindeer, which were, as Sam indicated, more intended to be recreational hunting, not really for sustainability. But there were attempts to introduce sheep because, of the sheep farming in the Falklands. It was thought, well, maybe we could have a permanent sheep population here. In terms of it being kind of a colony, one of the most interesting things I've found from documents from like the 50s, which is already after DI is over, is this sense of like you do find the language of colonialism. Like you know, a guy on a whaling ship wrote a memoir after where he talks about it was like the worst, the like worst place for a white man in the British Empire, and like the worst administered and like the filthiest and all of that. You also see the development of I've seen a couple references to it, South Georgia English, which is like a pidgin language combining English, Norwegian, and Spanish. And so there does develop some really interesting, you know, very clear features of like what would be like a colonial city in another context there. And as Sam said, this is not just in South Georgia or just in the Falklands, because by 1931, the British Empire has claimed almost all of the Antarctic. Technically, parts of it are designated as like New Zealand for Australia, and those are still like claimed by New Zealand and Australia. But like in some of the Australian subantarctic islands in I think 1925, a company proposed building a whaling and mining community in some of the Australian or New Zealand subantarctic islands, and bringing in Eskimos to as the labor force for that. And nothing ever came of this, but you can see this was very much on people's minds of like, what can we do to like make our new colonies to the south financially viable?
Well, better piece soon. Okay, so thank you, Sam and Daniella, and please join us for the second part of this panel at 3 o'clock, and there's refreshments in Prince Hall. Thank you.
Scott, did you want to ask us something since we were just chilling out?
I was trying to clap.
Oh, nice.
But I will ask, well, but just now that you're here, have you guys looked at James Blair's recent book? It's more of like
yes.
Okay.
I wrote a review of it for,
did you? Okay.
for modern British history.
Okay. Did you like it? I haven't read the review or the book.
I don't know that I should be saying stuff so publicly about things.
Well, I'll read your review.
It's an interesting book. It draws on a lot of history, but it is anthropology. He has a small section on the he doesn't talk about what we're talking about at all. He doesn't talk about the DI or anything. But there's a small section on South Georgia, but it doesn't engage with the Antarctic otherwise. Which, you know, the section on South Georgia, you know, it's about the reindeer eradication program, which was finished off. It started in, I want to say 13, and they killed the last one, I think, in 17.
Oh, wow.
It's pretty recent, or maybe they started in 11. It's recent. It took a few years to, and something that's interesting about that is they actually imported Norwegian sharpshooters to take care of that problem.
Takes one to know one.
Well, I mean, basically, rather than having the British do it, they like brought in Norwegian hunters to do it for them, which I think is sort of funny. I went to the SCAR conference in 2015, the science conference, which was in New Zealand, and this was like big news because it was like a pretty new project and like ongoing, and people were asking about, is the reindeer going to still be on the flag of South Georgia, because the South Georgian flag is a penguin and a reindeer. And then of course somebody from Argentina got up to remind everyone that they don't acknowledge the sovereignty of that flag with the reindeer on it. And it's in some ways that's why it's such a fun topic for thinking about imperialism, because in some ways it's so silly because there's no people there or anything, and so it becomes 100% about the symbols and language.
Right. Fascinating. We'll love the presentation.
By the way, have you read chapter 90 of Moby Dick? It talks about Wales as royal property.
I've read Moby Dick. I don't specifically remember chapter 90 of it.
It talks about, it satirizes the Duke of Wellington, maybe not entirely fairly, but it's just very interesting literary cross-reference about Wales and the imperial prerogatives.